In the summer of 1586, radical Catholics planned to assassinate Elizabeth I, Queen of England.
Queen Mary.
The plotters want to place the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne.
Mary dreamed that she was going to be freed. She might even become the Queen of England.
Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, is determined to stop them.
Walsingham's fear of Catholic conspiracy really literally keeps him awake at night.
He masterminds an extraordinary spy war to defend the Tudor dynasty. Double agents betray their masters. They send messages written in secret inks and complex codes.
This is a textbook piece of espionage. You know, you couldn't make it up for the purposes of fiction.
To save his queen, Walsingham must first kill a queen. In July 1586, in a moated house in Staffordshire, the most dangerous woman in England is practicing her Catholic faith. Mary, Queen of Scots, had been chased out of her own kingdom 18 years earlier by rebellious nobles. At first, Queen Elizabeth had offered her fellow monarch sanctuary. Mary, after all, was her second cousin. She was intelligent and charming. But the mood had darkened. Elizabeth now saw the Catholic Mary as a direct threat to her Protestant rule. Elizabeth had reigned successfully for 25 years, but she had never married, and she had no heir.
This really was Tudor England looking down the barrel of a gun. I mean, this was a period where there was no successor. Elizabeth had refused pressure to marry. If Elizabeth died, it would be the end of the Tudor dynasty, a dynasty that had reigned for more than 100 years. You know, people had grown up knowing nothing else than the Tudors.
Her father, Henry VIII, had broken with Rome, setting Protestants against Catholics. England was surrounded by powerful Catholic enemies in France and Spain. They saw their fellow Catholic, Mary, Queen of Scots, as the legitimate heir to the English throne.
Mary, Queen of Scots, represented so many dangers. She was preeminently a dynastic threat to the Queen. Elizabeth's government believed that Catholics, all Catholics, believed that Mary was England's true Queen and not Elizabeth.
Catholicism had been banned in England, and the faith had been driven underground. The priests who practiced it risked their lives.
Just by being a Catholic, you were equated with being a traitor. So religious belief, Catholic belief, became treason.
This was the man charged with preventing Catholic resentment turning into rebellion. Sir Francis Walsingham was an ardent Protestant. He was the Queen's principal secretary and a leading member of her Privy Council.
Walsingham's fear of Catholic conspiracy really literally keeps him awake at night. He's fearful of Catholic rebellion, he's fearful of conspiracy, and he's fearful of invasion. And above all, he's fearful of all of these coming together around the person of Mary, Queen of Scots.
Walsingham even feared that Mary posed a threat to England's Protestant faith.
So long as that devilish woman liveth, neither her majesty must make account to continue her quiet possession of her crown, nor her faithful servants assure themselves of safety of their lives.
Walsingham's fears were well founded. During the early 1580s, at least 3 assassination plots against Elizabeth were exposed.
There was one plot that was uncovered that would have poisoned the saddle of her horse, the pommel of her horse, and the belief that she, you know, when she touched it, the poisonous vapors would be absorbed into her skin. Now, this obviously didn't work, but there were fears too that poison might be placed in Elizabeth's food or in her bedsheets.
The most dangerous was an international conspiracy masterminded by a high-ranking English gentleman called Sir Francis Throckmorton.
Francis Throckmorton is intercepted in his chamber in London when he's actually in the process of writing a letter to Mary, Queen of Scots. Other correspondence is found in his chamber relating to safe landing places for a foreign navy and to English Catholic nobles who could be expected to rise up with this foreign Catholic invading force to support the liberation of Mary, Queen of Scots. And Walsingham is so shaken by that, I think, that it puts another spur into his Secret Service activity.
To defend the realm, Walsingham set up an intelligence HQ at his house in the crowded streets around the Tower of London. He was intercepting letters passing between the Catholic governments in France and Spain and their embassies in London. He was hunting for evidence of plots against Elizabeth. His team of specially recruited agents began to spy on Catholic enemies.
We have a picture of Walsingham's study in his home in the City of London, and it's an absolute mass of paper. There are bundles of interrogations, correspondence, maps, books. There's information constantly flowing in. There are letters constantly flowing out.
Walsingham's operation was MI5 and MI6 rolled into one.
Walsingham had a very effective system of intercepting correspondence, even abroad, on the post roads of Europe. He had an expert forger on the payroll, someone who was expert at opening packets and resealing packets. So it was, by Elizabethan standards, a rather extensive intelligence operation.
Yes.
He's also got agents operating out in the field, keeping watch on Catholic houses, keeping watch on the ports. Agents who are sufficiently plausible within the Catholic community that they can be dropped into prisons to listen to the kind of correspondence, listen to the conversations that are going on in prisons amongst Catholic prisoners. It's a very good source of intelligence. Beyond that, of course, he's also got a much wider international network of agents all the way from Lisbon to Constantinople. And the interesting thing about a lot of these men is they're not loyal to some overall overarching Elizabethan secret service. They're Walsingham's own servants. They're personally loyal to him.
Above all, Walsingham wanted to stop the plotting between Mary and her supporters. He needed brilliant linguists and clever codebreakers, and he found one in his Cambridge-educated chief assistant, Thomas Phillips.
The work that Phillips was doing, along with the other code breakers at the time, is equivalent to the work that, say, Turing was doing at Bletchley Park in the Second World War. It's essentially the kind of cutting-edge research and level of expertise in cryptanalysis that is currently being done by GCHQ in the United Kingdom or NSA in America.
Walsingham would break all the rules in his war on Catholic extremism. Phillips and his team of agents would forge documents, torture priests, and entrap suspects. Nothing was off limits. Walsingham's fear of a Catholic rising in England was rooted deeply in his own traumatic experience. In August 1572, he was the English ambassador in Paris. Here, he witnessed one of the bloodiest massacres in 16th century history. It began early on August the 23rd, St. Bartholomew's Day.
It's a bell tolling from this church, Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, that ignites a general uprising of the Catholics of Paris against their Protestant neighbours.
The slaughter began with the murder of one man, but quickly spread to all Protestants, known as Huguenots, across the entire city.
Tucked away off this busy Paris street is this statue to Gaspard de Coligny, who was the first and one of the greatest victims of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Coligny was Admiral of France, and he was the leader of the Protestant Huguenot faction at court. He was a man that Walsingham knew well. Coligny's death was particularly horrible. Having been shot, he was then stabbed many times. His body was thrown out of a window, and he was mutilated. Now, Coligny was a nobleman, of course, but the same fate befell many ordinary citizens of Paris.
Hundreds of dead and dying victims were hurled into the River Seine.
What has to be kept in mind is the fury, the rapidity of the deeds, those people taken out, slaughtered, heaps of bodies in the streets, bodies that were heaped on carts and dumped in the river.
The killers wanted to wipe all trace of the Protestant Huguenots from the city.
There are a number of anecdotes of witnesses that saw women, pregnant women, being stabbed, being killed in the street and thrown into the river. The water of the river had turned red as blood, and people say that there were cradles on the river of those infants that had been killed and thrown into the water to make sure that the Huguenots would not survive.
Around 3,000 people were butchered in Paris, a third of all the Protestants in the capital. Thousands more were killed in other towns across France.
Walsingham must have been kept within the embassy so that he wasn't in the streets when the slaughter occurred. But he must have heard the screams of those people that were killed in the streets. He must have smelt the bodies being burnt by the murderers. He must have known and seen, perhaps through the windows, what was occurring around the embassy.
Walsingham was traumatized by what he saw as a slaughter of the innocents.
Without pity and compassion, without regard had either of age or sex, without ordinary form of justice. Nothing is meant but extremity towards those of the Protestant religion.
He's tried to get his family out of the embassy, and his wife and her entourage have been beaten up at one of the Paris city gates. So Walsingham was in genuine danger, I think, during the massacre. And this really sears itself into his mind. He never forgets what he witnesses, the murder and massacre of his friends and his Protestant co-religionists. And from that moment on, he is absolutely determined to prevent scenes of sectarian violence like this leaching into England.
In the 1580s, Paris remained a hotbed for radical Catholics, including influential English exiles fleeing from Elizabeth's Protestant regime.
We have perhaps 300-400 young men, women, families who've gone over to Paris. And a number of them are just escaping persecution. But there's also something else going on there, I think. These are people who back home in England would have been power holders, power brokers. They're accustomed to being involved in politics, accustomed to being involved in government. And in Paris, they have the space to start to organize. And what they want to organize is the re-Catholicization of England from a position of safety.
Among these exiles were a handful who preached the violent overthrow of Elizabeth as a heretic queen. Mary, Queen of Scots, stayed in touch with them through Thomas Morgan, her chief of intelligence.
Thomas Morgan is an absolutely key player in Mary, Queen of Scots' intelligence operation in Paris. He's a specialist in ciphers. He's a cryptographer. He devises perhaps 40 separate cipher alphabets for Queen Mary. But he's also important because of the people he recruits.
In the winter of 1585, Morgan was trying to send secret letters to Mary. He needed a trusted courier, and that December he found one. He was an English Catholic gentleman who had once trained as a priest.
Gilbert Gifford, a young Catholic radical, meets Morgan, and he evidently makes a very instantly favourable impression on Morgan, because Morgan immediately trusts him to convey letters back to Mary, Queen of Scots.
We need to make sure our letters get back to our Queen Mary.
Gilbert Gifford was perfect for Morgan. He was a young man, used to travelling. He had impeccable Catholic credentials in England. His family came from Staffordshire, and Staffordshire was the county where Mary was held prisoner.
And make sure you guide them home.
Gifford's mission was immensely dangerous. Many Catholic exiles returning to England risked severe punishment if they were picked up by the security services. Walsingham was even prepared to use torture to extract information from suspects.
He should be forced by torture to deliver what he knoweth. Without torture, I know we shall not prevail.
But torture was illegal in England, so Walsingham had to seek a special royal warrant to use it. He argued that Catholic priests brought to the Tower of London for questioning posed a direct threat to England's security. His prisoners were kept in the Beauchamp Tower.
It was reserved for the most important and dangerous prisoners of the Elizabethan era, and at that time those prisoners were the Jesuits or fanatical Catholics whose mission was to come over to England and bring the country back to the Catholic fold. Most of the men who were brought here suffered horrific torture at the hands of Elizabeth's interrogators. That included the rack, where they would literally be pulled apart, and then the reverse of that was called the scavenger's daughter, which was a horrible contraption which would literally compress the air and even the blood from their bodies. It was horrific torture, and it was employed justifiably because these men were accused of treachery, of being a traitor to the state.
The fear of arrest and torture forced many radical Catholics, like Gilbert Gifford, underground. But during the 1580s, support networks grew up across England. Rich Catholic families built secret chambers in their country houses to conceal priests. John Cooper is visiting Harvington Hall, built by the Packington family, to discover some of the most remarkable hiding places in Britain. The house has 7 secret chambers, or priest holes. John has not visited Harvington before, and his challenge now is to find them.
It's actually very difficult to find priest holes in a house of this period. The first priest holes that were constructed were pretty rudimentary, I think, but by the time that this house was built, the 1580s, or this part of the house, they're really becoming very sophisticated and very complicated. They needed to be, because by the 1580s, to be a Catholic priest is to lead a hunted existence. Oh. That's it. My first priest hole.
In the 16th century, the entrance to the pit would have been disguised as part of the floor.
And my word, it is terrifying. It's a pit, 12, maybe even 14 feet down. Oh my word, it must have been claustrophobic down there. It's really scary, actually. Time to come out, I think. I feel quite unsettled having been in there. It was, as I say, it was cold and claustrophobic, but there's an atmosphere as well, I think. I mean, I'm not sure I believe in ghosts and the supernatural, but you can certainly feel the presence of history in a place like that.
But while John was first walking up the main staircase, he missed the most cleverly concealed priest hole of all. The men who built it knew they were playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek with Walsingham's agents. Catholic households sometimes concealed priests like Gilbert Gifford for days, while their homes were searched repeatedly. In the end, guide Barbara Parks had to reveal the hall's most secret chamber.
Good heavens, look at that. Do people have any idea that this is here? When visitors come to the house, they must just walk up the stairs as I walked up the stairs.
And walk straight over it.
Walk straight over it?
Yes.
What do you think it was like to be hidden away in a priest hole like that?
Must have been terrifying. They were usually very, very dark. You'd have nothing to eat or drink, no toilet facilities, and all you could do was wait and hope and pray. but you wouldn't be found. And all the time around you, you could hear the searchers knocking the house to pieces to try to find you, and you knew what would await you at the end of it if they did.
Gilbert Gifford reached Chartley Hall, where Mary was under house arrest in early 1586. He now had to smuggle his secret correspondence past Mary's jailer, Sir Amias Paulet.
He was a brute. He would come into her presence chamber and he would tear down her cloth of estate. He would pull down the sort of the regalia, you know, that was associated with her queenship, because he said there could only be one queen in England. And Mary would protest, and sometimes she would burst into tears, and then he would sort of storm off.
Paulet ordered regular unannounced searches, but he insulted Mary's royal status even further.
He would strip search some of Mary's servants, including women servants, because some of them clearly did have to have access to the outside world. I mean, if only for sort of domestic things like laundry. Of course, that was all hugely offensive. I mean, it breached all sort of diplomatic protocol. I mean, Mary was actually rather experienced and rather clever at getting correspondence in and out after she'd had quite a lot of practice, you know, since she'd been under house arrest. And so, as well as letters just sort of essentially being slipped in, either through the pages of books that were coming in, or possibly through, you know, through small packets, letters were put inside the heels of her shoes. I mean, remember, she was still a queen, and so she was getting, you know, the sort of top shoe makers of Paris to send her smart shoes.
Mary dealt with the security clampdown by turning to spycraft herself. She even sent messages in invisible ink. Professor James Daybell is an expert in the history of secret writing.
I'm now going to perform an experiment of invisible ink, one of the classic ways in the 16th century of sending secret correspondence. And the experiment that I'm going to be doing is based on lemon juice. And the writer would write a secret message in lemon juice, and then, in order to read it, you would warm it in front of a flame, such as the candle that we have here, and reveal the hidden writing. One needs to keep it in front of the flame in one spot in order to allow the juice to warm up.
James knows there's a message written on the paper, but he has no idea what it says.
It looks like a K here, followed by an I and an L, just about discernible. Kill. T-H-E, the. Q, and a U, kill the Queen.
Did you know that was the message?
No. No, it was completely invisible to me. Nobody holding a piece of paper like this would have known that there was something written on it. And this was indeed what was intended, that it was supposed to pass as an ordinary piece of writing, only to be revealed by the holding it in front of a flame.
But secret inks were no use when Walsingham's men were intercepting all Mary's letters. The Catholic courier Gilbert Gifford had to find a new way of breaking the security cordon around Mary. The solution was spycraft genius. Every day, barrels of beer were sent from a brewery in Burton to Mary's prison in Chartley Hall. The bung of the barrel made a perfect hiding place for secret messages.
The brilliance is in a sense that it's concealing a secret in plain sight. Nobody would think to search a large barrel full of beer.
This is a textbook piece of espionage. You know, you couldn't make it up for the purposes of fiction, because actually what they were doing was getting the very letters, the correspondence that everybody most wanted to see, under the noses of the guards, just to and fro. It was just openly paraded. Of course, nobody knew about it because it was so well concealed.
At last, there was the promise of a secure channel to communicate with Mary. In the summer of 1586, extremists planning the downfall of Elizabeth could now tell the Queen of Scots about their astonishing plan. Walsingham's agents gathered intelligence about these plots against Queen Elizabeth. One of their targets was a group of rich young Catholics whose ringleader was a gentleman called Anthony Babington. Babington had met Thomas Morgan, Mary's agent, in Paris.
What runs in parallel with Gilbert Gifford's efforts to get letters to and from Mary at Chartley was a group of young Catholic men began to talk about how difficult it was to be Catholic in Elizabethan England. Their worries are about persecution, their worries are about their families and their livelihood. And it would seem that over time and conversation, disgruntlement turns and shapes into a plan.
2 weeks from today, October 7th.
Walsingham already has Anthony Babington in his sights, and he knows about some of the other conspirators as well. And the really frightening thing about a number of the Babington plotters and conspirators is how close they are to the royal court. Some of them have positions, minor positions at court, or they have access to the court, and that means that they are a genuinely credible threat to the person of the Queen.
To do the same.
At first, Babington's group talked only of freeing Mary, Queen of Scots. But that summer, their plan became even more ambitious.
The big twist and the big development over the June and July of 1586 was that plan became an effort to get rid of Elizabeth once and for all, and it became a plan for assassination.
The plan grew into an international conspiracy when a Catholic priest called John Ballard arrived in London from Paris.
This meeting between Babington and Ballard is absolutely crucial. What happens apparently is that Babington tells Ballard there are 4 gentlemen who are willing to assassinate Elizabeth. Ballard then goes over to France, reports this to Mendoza, the Spanish ambassador, who then reports it to his master, Philip II. So it seems to Philip and the other Catholic powers of Europe that there are men willing and able and ready to kill their queen.
On the 15th of July, Anthony Babington wrote an infamous letter to Mary, Queen of Scots.
Myself, with 10 gentlemen and 100 of our followers, will undertake the delivery of your royal person from the hands of your enemies.
The letter also described how another group would assassinate Elizabeth.
For the dispatch of the usurper, there be 6 noble gentlemen, who for the zeal they bear the Catholic cause and service to your majesty, will undertake that tragical execution.
I think there would have been a huge gulp as she read that letter, because of course in that letter was everything that Mary had hoped for, that those around her had sought to mastermind for years. But of course there it was written down in so many words, and the very fact that it was on paper was also hugely dangerous.
The thing about Mary is that she's actually very clever. She's not at all stupid about this, and of course she's quite experienced in she's very experienced in diplomacy. She's also by this time quite experienced in intrigue, and she is suspicious naturally of what should happen, and she also knows that she has to be very circumspect in the way that she replies to Babington.
Mary's reaction when she received the letter was to proceed very, very cautiously. This was a point of contention. What did she do? What did she write? Probably very little. If Mary responded, it was by dictation. Notes were taken by her secretaries, and it took them a long time to compose the letter. It was composed over just over a week.
But on July the 21st, disaster struck. Mary's letter was intercepted by her enemies. It was meant for Babington and the plotters who wanted to free her, but it went straight to Thomas Phillips, Walsingham's right-hand man and chief codebreaker. the spymaster had outwitted the Queen of Scots. He'd been intercepting every single letter sent by the barrel method. Gilbert Gifford, the courier who Mary had entrusted with her secret correspondence, was in fact a double agent.
Yes.
He'd been turned by Walsingham when he first arrived in England.
The truth was that Gilbert Gifford was captured, was picked up at the port of Rye in December, and that from that moment, after an interview with Walsingham, perhaps with Phillips too, he was under their control, and he was their man.
My family.
And your family.
The genius of Francis Walsingham as an intelligence chief is revealed by the fact that he has been running the action of the Babington plot since the beginning. So in effect, the Babington plot is a sting operation.
It was a brilliant coup. At last, it seemed that Elizabeth's greatest enemy, Mary, Queen of Scots, could be exposed and destroyed. But the letter they had intercepted from Mary was in code, one of the most sophisticated of its day.
If you'd intercepted one of Mary's coded letters, what you would have seen on the page is just what looks like a random set of symbols. There would have been various marks, and it would just look like someone, it would almost look like a spider had crawled across the piece of paper.
Cracking Mary's codes takes us deep into the Elizabethan love of strange symbols and hidden meanings. She used substitution codes, in which unusual characters represent individual letters of the alphabet.
What we're looking at the screen now is a fragment of one of the letters that would have been sent by Mary. So as you can see, it just looks like a bunch of random symbols and characters. We can't see any information about what the underlying English will be. And if you look at it, it just does seem random. But if we look at it more closely, we suddenly see that some letters are more common than others. Now, it's a pretty good guess that if the underlying language is English, then the most common letter that we see is likely to correspond to the letter E, because the letter E is the most common letter in English. And then we start pursuing other letters within English. The letters T and O are very common in English, so we try and work out what the next most common letters are and substitute those in for the underlying plain text. Suddenly it's starting to look a bit more English.
If only it was that simple. But Mary's code writers knew how Walsingham's cryptographers worked, so they built in some clever little traps.
To complicate matters for the person trying to break the code, the person who's made the code has added in extra details that hide the underlying English. So, for example, they've added in letters which correspond to complete words. So, for example, they'll have a character which will correspond to a common word like but, or the, or and. And this makes the task of the cryptanalysts much more difficult because they've got much more statistical information they need to recover.
As Phillips laboured over the letter, unlocking its secrets, he made an extraordinary discovery. Babington had told Mary about the 6 noble gentlemen who would assassinate Elizabeth. Mary's reply was cautious, but it contained one incriminating sentence.
By what means do the 6 gentlemen deliberate to proceed?
Phillips must have been amazed at what he saw. This is the piece of evidence of Mary's complicity in Babington plot. This is the piece of evidence that Phillips and Walsingham need to prove that Mary, Queen of Scots, is guilty of treason. It's the evidence that they've been hunting for months and years, and Phillips has it in his hand. And he's so delighted with this that he draws a gallows on his copy of the original because he realises this is the piece of evidence which is going to hang Mary, Queen of Scots.
He's, at least at first, he's absolutely euphoric. And of course, he writes this little gallows on the back, which is to say, gotcha. The thing is, though, that he then reflects upon it a little bit more, and then he starts to worry. Have we really got her? There's this problem. The letter of Babington and Mary's letter have got to be read together, and what does "and now set the gentle..." And then set the six gentlemen to work, what does that actually mean?
Mary Queen of Scots?
Yes, they are.
Walsingham and Phillips worried that Mary's phrase was not enough to guarantee her conviction. So they decided to let the plot continue to see if Babington and Mary would incriminate themselves further.
From the Spanish ambassador, I think.
It's very important for Walsingham to wait and see how many people will respond when Mary sends the letter to Anthony Babington mobilizing this conspiracy.
Incredibly, Phillips now forged a postscript to Mary's coded letter. The news section asked Babington for more information about the six gentlemen who were going to kill Elizabeth.
It's as if Mary is asking Babington to prove his allegiance by naming his co-conspirators. That is something of a gamble.
But Walsingham's gamble went horribly wrong. Although Phillips was tracking Anthony Babington, on August the 2nd, he lost him. The would-be assassin was loose on the streets of London. Then Walsingham got lucky. By pure chance, another of his agents spotted Babington the next day. The spymaster now had to decide whether to pull him in or to leave him free to reply to Mary's letter.
It is a hard matter to resolve. Only this I conclude. It were better to lack the answer than to lack the man.
Come on.
But Walsingham acted too late.
Richmond.
I don't know.
The conspirators were already fearful of discovery.
Cousin Hereford.
Then, by chance, one of them was arrested for an unrelated offence.
Babington panicked on the 4th of August when John Ballard was picked up not as a conspirator but as a Catholic priest. Babington was profoundly worried. He panicked, he ran. The conspirators, the group of conspirators, dispersed.
With Babington on the run, Walsingham turned his attention to Mary. On August the 11th, she was offered a brief taste of freedom, a chance to go out riding.
Mary's been kept in. She's been kept in actually for weeks and months. The one thing she wants to do is to get outside, and they say, you can go riding. Her legs are quite good that day. She mounts her horse. It's the first time, in fact, for ages that she's been on horseback. They come out, she has her servants with her, they ride out, and then just as they're going over the brow of a small hill, in front of her she sees what she believes to be 10 Catholic gentlemen and 100 followers riding towards her. And for her, this is an apocalyptic moment, because it seems that it's all going to come true. She's going to be rescued, she's going to be freed, she may even become the Queen of England.
But the riders were Walsingham's men. Mary had been lured out that summer's day so that her lodgings could be searched for evidence. Now Walsingham's trap was about to spring shut.
When the leader of the posse approached, he spoke to Amias Paulet, and Paulet told Mary that she was to be taken here to Tixall through this gateway. At this, she attempted to lie her way out of the situation. She said, why would I plot against my good cousin, Elizabeth? This is not me. I know nothing about this so-called plot to kill her. Paulet wasn't having any of this, you're coming with us, this is it. You've got to do what you're told.
Mary, Queen of Scots, the thorn in the side of Protestant England, had finally been snared. Now Walsingham had to persuade Elizabeth to order the execution of her fellow queen. To Walsingham, Mary was public enemy number one. His spy operation had trapped the Queen of Scots. A few days later, England's most wanted man, Anthony Babington, was finally tracked down, hiding in a barn near Harrow. Babington and the other conspirators were taken to the Tower.
This is a piece of graffiti by one of the key conspirators in the Babington plot, John Ballard. In 1586, after he'd been arrested, he was here in the Beauchamp Tower. And here he says, "Hope in God." He realises that the end is nigh. These were men who devoutly believed in their cause. They were not just going to crumble at the first sign of torture or threat. And so they really withheld as much as possible the interrogations of Elizabeth's ministers. But eventually they had to give way, and they suffered terribly for that.
Babington and 13 others were sentenced to a hideous death.
Elizabeth had intervened and wanted their deaths to be specially horrible as a warning to all conspirators. They were hanged until they were nearly dead. They were taken down from the scaffold. Their bodies were ripped open and they were disemboweled. Their bowels were burnt in front of them, and then their limbs were removed and put on poles at prominent public sites all around London. This was an appalling and visceral warning against treason.
3 weeks after the execution of the Babington plotters, Mary herself was brought to trial. She denied the charges and turned on Walsingham, accusing him of entrapment.
Mary put her finger on this because at the trial, she actually calls Walsingham briefly to account. You know, she says, you know, basically, you've used immoral methods. You've trapped me. She knew that she'd been got by some form of entrapment, but didn't know quite exactly what it was.
Mary even dared to ask Walsingham whether he was an honest man.
I assure you that I bear no ill will to no one. I have attempted no one's death. I protest that I am a man of conscience and a faithful servant to my mistress.
Walsingham would not admit that he had actively controlled the entire plot. No mention of recruiting Gilbert Gifford. No acknowledgement that Mary's letters had been sent via the beer barrel system set up by Walsingham's men. He sidestepped all Mary's accusations by making just one bland admission.
I confess that I am ever vigilant regarding all concerning the safety of my queen and country. I have closely watched all conspiracies against either.
These are weasel words, really. I mean, the fact is, she'd been framed. Yes, there was a plot, but you know, if this was a case that was going to be reheard in the US Supreme Court, she'd get off because it was entrapment.
He does engage in acts of entrapment, but at the core of it, some of these conspiracies, some of this Catholic threat is real, I think, and there is this shadow of a chance that without Francis Walsingham, one of those assassins would have got through. Elizabeth might have been poisoned, she might have been shot, she might have been run through with a rapier, and then the course of English history would have been very different.
There could only be one verdict in Mary's trial. On October the 25th, she was sentenced to death for conspiring to murder Elizabeth. But Elizabeth delayed signing Mary's execution warrant.
She was a fellow monarch, blessed by God, however many crimes she had committed. And Elizabeth, I think, really felt that to execute Mary was, in a sense, to set a pretty awful precedent.
Elizabeth finally signed the warrant in February 1587, but even then she wouldn't release it.
Elizabeth signed Mary's death warrant pretty reluctantly, and she appears, or at least she said, that she countermanded her action fairly quickly. But the warrant was whisked away on the orders of the Privy Council. It was carried to Fotheringay, it was taken to Sir Amias Paulet, Mary's keeper, and Mary was executed within practically hours.
Elizabeth was furious. She says that she hadn't sanctioned this. She threatens to throw all of her councillors in the Tower. In the days after the execution, Elizabeth, neither eats nor sleeps. I mean, she's completely tormented by what's happened. She actually feels like it's undermined her position, by virtue of the fact that she says that she was, that the councillors had acted without her direct say-so.
Walsingham escaped the Queen's rage. He'd been absent from court, suffering from a serious illness.
The terrible pressure, the stress of dealing with all of these Catholic conspiracies increasingly begins to break him. His eyesight starts to fail. This is the point at which his handwriting becomes very, very difficult to read. He starts suffering from mysterious pains that leave him bedridden, sometimes for weeks, sometimes even for months at a time. And yet he's forced to carry on working. The Queen won't let him go.
Over the next few months, Elizabeth would rely even more heavily on Walsingham's spy operation. The consequences of executing the Queen of Scots were serious.
From Elizabeth's point of view, in executing Mary, what had happened was that she had been a party to the killing of a divine right queen. These were rulers who they believed had been put there by God, and they were accountable only to God. If you become a party to killing a fellow ruler, you have in effect devalued monarchy. And indeed in England, it did largely make it accountable to Parliament after that time. And you couldn't have cut off Charles I's head in 1649 with quite such ease if you hadn't first of all cut off Mary Stuart's head.
Walsingham had hoped that Mary's death would remove the Catholic threat. Instead, her execution enraged the Catholic world. A year later, King Philip of Spain launched an armada against England. Once again, Walsingham's intelligence operation turned to the defense of the realm. He'd saved his queen. Now he had to save his country.